Hello, I'm going to be talking about the Middle Ages. It's voiced by me, and the whole slides and everything like that, it's presented by me. So, first off, anything about the timelines or the introduction, we're going to be discussing the main reason of how people died in the time periods, and we'll also view the deaths. We're going to be looking at many of the main reasons why people died, like the bubonic plague, childbirth, the Great Famine, and we're going to be looking towards the attitudes towards death and how people viewed it. And so let's get into it. And I hope you're looking at the slide. For everybody here, welcome. Yuri, it's a pleasure to have you. But I hope you're looking at the slides as I say it, just so then we can get a better understanding. Right now we're on slide 2, going into slide 3. The first thing I'm going to be talking about is more of the facts about how people died. And the first thing I'm going to be talking about is the bubonic plague. And the plague, or many names like the Black Death, pestilence, great mortality, it has killed around 75 million people to 200 million people. It began in Central Asia or East Asia. That's what people believed it to be. It came from either many different ways. I'll be discussing that in my next slide. And was the second great disaster in Europe during the Middle Ages. We're going to continue on to the fourth slide here. It's the bubonic plague continued. It started in 1346 and ended in 1353. It killed 30 to 60% of the population in Europe. Many of the people around blamed the heavens for the plague. It was taught to be religious in many ways. It was like a martyrdom and mercy from God, assuring quote unquote, assuring the believers place in paradise. For non-believers, it was a punishment. It was said to be spread by rats and fleas, and also that it was not hygienic in the slightest. The streets were filthy with live animals and parasites. Human parasites, any kind of parasite, whatever, would transmit the disease or the plague. And now moving into slide 5, it's continued. The symptoms included fever, headaches, painful aching joints, nausea, vomiting, and uneasiness. One symptom that was commonly noted was the appearance of buboes. If untreated, 80% of the people would die within the first 8 days. The common side effects of it, they would look like tumors, which would grow the size of apples or even eggs, which in turn changed showing black spots were few and large, or there were some where they were small but many. It was said to be a sign of death. So if you had, say, these kind of symptoms where you would have big ol' dots on you, or anything of the sorts, like small dots, but there were many, kind of like the chicken pox, you were expected to die. And it was followed by vomiting blood, not just vomiting by itself, but vomiting blood and acute fever. Which we move into slide 6, which is the plague doctors and how they played a role to try and stop this disease. They specialized in helping anyone with disease, hired by all classes. They were hired by townfolk, they were hired by the royals, the nobles, anyone of the sort, to try and help heal the illness or the disease or the plague that was the Black Death or the pestilence. They did many different ways to treat the patient. They did autopsies on the corpses, and they would also make listings of the people that died. Many of the ways they treated them was by bloodletting, leeches, and toads that were used every single day. One notable person that tried to help and cure the disease was Nostradamus. He was a famous plague doctor, and he gave brand new views on how they should take care of patients, like removing infected corpses, letting the patient get fresh air, drinking clean water, and drinking a juice made of rose hips. Um, their appearance may be weird. They often look like birds or anything of the psych or anything of um, that kind of appearance, but it was to protect themselves from the bad air or any kind of miasma. They wore hats to show their profession and always had a cane so they can diagnose a patient without touching them. That's just to ensure their own safety. The plague was brutal. It would kill anyone without mercy. And regardless, they would wear clothing from head to toe with their mask filled with different kinds of substances. At that time, they believed that if you were to put mint or any kind of cloves that would get rid of the scent of the air, otherwise known as a filter, they can kind of cure away the disease or the pestilence and not be infected as much as, say, the patients were. And so they were like way above or ahead of their time when they thought of filters or anything like that, which moves us into slide 7, which is childbirth. Another reason why people were dying, and very frequently, it was dangerous to all women. Um, any women could die, or any girl, woman, whatever it would be, um, could die. It was 1 out of 3 that would die from either giving birth or the complications that would come afterwards. It was a very dreadful kind of situation. Um, and to know if the person was pregnant was hard. Um, Many women wouldn't know if they were pregnant until the baby was actually kicking at their stomach. And the tests that were ran by doctors or of the sort were not reliable. It would be mostly about their urine if they peed on a needle, if it rusted, or like anything of the such like that. Um, Not much information was given for the poor, but with nobility, some info can be shed where they can close themselves off and an elaborate service was held by the church. And they would ask God for his blessing. Many people of that time were very religious. One thing I will say is that Christianity and anything of the sort were viewed as the high mark or whatever it may be, that would be the end all be all, which moves us into slide 8, which would be the Great Famine. The Great Famine took place in 1315 to 1317, and it affected 30 million people in Europe. The famine killed about 5 to 10% of the people, of the 30 million. The events that caused it were far and many. The falling of the West Roman Empire and many wars to follow it were a big factor of why the famine was caused. The global cooling from 536 to 660 was a big impact, and it continued to impact throughout the next, century. And the plague of Justine, which was at 541 to 700, which was a plague that affected a lot of people, and I won't get into it because it's nothing as great as what the bubonic plague was. And then from there, we'll get into slide 9, which is Philip Aries. And this man right here developed a lot of crucial thoughts to how we view death nowadays. He was a French historian and wrote a lot about the topic of death. The subject was the history of death. He wrote about death and mentalities, and is credited with the introducing death as a topic for historical inquiries. Aries saw America as influencing the Europeans and how they viewed death and how their whole perspective changed on death. He made 4 books covering a millennia of history. which was all part of one big old book. It's not four different books, it's all part of one book, but put into four different sections. Tame death, one's own death, thy death, and forbidden death. His book explains many different time periods and their views on death as a whole. The name of the book was called Western's Attitude Towards Death. And Philip Aries, and we're on to slide 10 now. One's own death is made specifically for the 11th to 12th century. It discussed the idea that personalization of death was apparent, and the Last Judgment saw a whole new meaning. For the Last Judgment, it was based on if you were good, you would go to heaven, and if you did sin or were bad, then your sins or whatever would be put against you. And then from there, it would be a trial for God to decide whether or not you would go to heaven or hell or whatever it was between. And the introduction to individual tomes with inscriptions grew in popularity. Being able to mark your tombstone or whatever, it grew in that kind of time period as well. Which moves us into slide 12, and that's the understanding of death's views. Before we do talk about this, we must see the different views on it at this time. Cruentation, or the understanding that the dead bodies could bleed before their murders. The understanding that if you were to cut the murderer or dead body before the murderer, that it would bleed, and therefore marking the murderer as being the one that did it. In King James Demonology in 1597, it's described as, in a secret murder, if the dead carcass be at any time therefore handled by the murderer, it will gush out blood as if blood were crying to the heavens for revenge on the assassin. That's a very deep quote, but I won't go into it any further. It's for you to decide how you make of it. Overcrowding was commonplace to free up space for new burials. Bones and skeletons were neatly stacked in ossuaries, said to have religious meaning to encourage believers to meditate on their mortal state. I can't even talk. Urging visitors to repent and prepare spiritually for death. The dead coming back to interact after death was widespread during the time. Either it was a demon or a divine miracle. Many people saw and believed that people would rise from the dead. No matter how the situation was, there was people in Sweden that saw it. There was people in Europe or all over Europe that saw it. And if the demon or divine miracle, if it was a demon, it was not going away, it was haunting people, then after an exorcism, it would get away. But if it was a divine miracle, it would go away within a certain time period. It was hard to define the two, but this is what I was able to come up with, which moves us into slide 12 or 13. I don't remember. Continuing on that point, there was a big fear of sudden death, and it was viewed to be for murderers, suicides, and those who had sinned against God, not for the honest and honorable people. So if you did not sin whatsoever and you were honorable towards God, you would not get the sudden death, or that's what people believed it to be. They would believe that the soul would wander for eternity in the world of the living, believing that the person could not prepare they couldn't believe that the person could not prepare spiritually. If the person did not prepare, and it's a whole Christian belief, or if you prepare for death, then you were able to go to the afterlife. But if you did not prepare whatsoever, then your soul would wander to the earth of the living, and from there, you would stay there eternally. And apparent death, the absence of breathing and movement and sensitivity, was usually enough to diagnose a person as being dead. In some cases, it tried to hurt the corpse to see if they were dead or not. The reason why I put this was it was hard to diagnose a patient as being dead or alive. Their methods were far in between. whether it be physical pain, breaking their fingers, like twisting them to a point where it would almost break to see if their body would feel it. And if they did not, they can diagnose them as being dead. Which leads us into slide 14. Attitudes towards death. Any attitude on death was heavily inspired by religion. In Europe, it was Christianity or Catholic beliefs. Living was hard. The life expectancy for males was 31 years of age, and anything above that was like an accomplishment. So, regardless, if you lived up to 30 or 25 years old, you were blessed by God. People were living to die. That is very symbolic, and not just symbolic, but it has very deep meaning. In that time period, you would be born if you were lucky enough. The mother would eventually die because not only of the birth itself, but because of the reason that it was complicated in that situation. It's hard to live beyond 30 or even 25. And the perspective on death was public, like regardless. The church would preach that the afterlife was the most worthwhile thing to look forward to, and people didn't fear death compared to how we see it today. And the reason why I say people were living to die was because even though the life expectancy was low, they could live their life according to the Christian belief, and they could they could eventually escape the unfortunate fate that they had when death came by, because they preached that death was nothing, but the afterlife is what you're basically living for. And anything regarding death all had roots to the church and how afterlife was achievable to the ones who did not sin. Again, relating back to religion. Then it brings us into slide 15 about what we can learn. One thing that we can basically learn is that death is an omnipotent force, and no matter how hard we try to run for it, it will come. To develop a mindset like the people in the medieval times where death was everywhere, embracing death but not letting it keep a hold of us. Many people, even myself included, have seen people die. I've witnessed many people die in my lifetime, even though it's been a short while. And it's to be able to live with the memory of them, but then not holding it against your whole human function. I've seen people who have seen people die, and then from there they were destroyed, not only mentally but also physically, to the point where they can basically not function. And then that leads me to my second point, and that's to be thankful for the life we were given and not try to live it out no matter what. In Christian belief, it is believed that if you were to commit suicide or anything of the sort, it was considered a sin. So regardless, you should live your life to the utmost, and try to fight no matter what. And that leads us into slide 15, I believe. And contemporary media attitudes on death. In this, everyone fears death. It starts in childhood, no matter what. Whoever you are, as long as you learn about death, you'll know that we are all mortal. And we figure out that death is inevitable. Death is always on our mindset and affects what actions we may do in some circumstances. In this modern society, it can be divided into two distinct groups. The ones that fear it and the ones that say, if it comes, it comes. Many people use media to get publicity about the subject and to help mourn over the one who had died or is dying. Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, these are great ways to show, oh my God, my grandfather is dying. Can somebody help me? And not only does it help the person, but it helps, I guess, their social status in a way. The idea of death doesn't seem real to many and will haunt them for months or even years compared to the medieval ages, which was embraced. Medieval ages saw death every day and they were like, it's okay. And the attitudes And the ideas we must view on death were written by Philip Aries. Most of anything you write or see about death as a whole was inspired by Philip Aries, and he wrote great books about it, and it's encouraged us, and not only that, but influenced our views on death as a whole to today, which leads us into slide 16, I believe, or 17, I do not remember. But the dance macabre, and the reason why I chose this is because it best depicts what was going on in medieval times. And not just that, but it was a wonderful piece of art. It displays a bunch of skeletons roaming around along with the people of the living. It has two meanings. The first one is that no matter what, the dead, you are dead, but you're also living. And if you, like, without one or the other, you can't coexist. And it also describes the universality of death and sets a reminder that life is a fragile thing and how all things go back to the earth. So no matter what, if you are alive, your parents or grandparents were in the ground. And it makes us realize that, as a whole, life and death are teeter-tottering on a big ol' swing where you can't choose which is which leads us into slide 17, I believe, the summary. A summary of it all. Death was everywhere, and many of the ways they saw death was as a savior to the afterlife by the Christian religion. Our understanding of death is very different from their views on it. In medieval times, they went through many hardship. What are our biggest factors influencing understanding to death? It's religion. Religion has always been a big role to how we view death. Family, friends, whatever. In this day and age, it's a very big impact to how we view death. To the point where you could be asked to be medically induced to die. But family is always a big role in how you view death and if you're willing to go through with it. And well, not only that, but if you're willing to fight for it. History. Talking about the medieval ages, how their views have changed compared to ours and how we live in a technological society. Our history has taught us that death, as we know it, is always behind our backs, behind our shoulders, whatever it may be. And that we should be fortunate and happy to be alive regardless. Like, 2 millennia ago, they were lucky to survive till 31 years of age. So we should take this and embrace it. From there, we get our references and my own thoughts. I believe that as a whole, I'm going to sit back a little bit here, that medieval times taught us more about death than we do know ourselves. They embraced death with wholeheartedness. They saw somebody dying and were willing to be compassionate enough to not only see the death, but then remember them through the acts that they did. Many of the acts that they did, I did not explain during this, but I read about them. But overall, like, our views on death are so much different from the medieval ages, where I think we should have more of a medieval kind of style to how we view death compared to what we do today, which is where we mourn for hours and hours, days, weeks, months, years, to the point where we can't function. And that's why I believe medieval times had such a better impact, and not only that, but a better mindset to what we do today, which leads us into the end. And I thank you for listening. I know it's been 25 minutes, but I thank you for listening through it all, and I hope you have some feedback. Thank you, and bye-bye.